Breathe in the incredibly thick, suffocating metallic smoke of the massive aluminum foundries and the completely nauseating, sickening stench of the industrial meatpacking plants that hangs constantly over the humid, sweltering dirt streets of East St. Louis, Illinois, in the early, volatile spring of 1917. You are standing directly in the brutal, beating mechanical heart of the American industrial war machine, a completely grimy, soot-stained, completely corrupt metropolis sitting on the eastern muddy banks of the Mississippi River that is desperately, aggressively churning out heavy resources, munitions, and raw materials for the horrific First World War currently raging across the Atlantic in the muddy trenches of Europe. This is not a city of beautiful architecture and quiet parks. This is an absolute industrial meat grinder, a chaotic, sprawling landscape of massive, towering smokestacks, heavy iron rail yards, completely toxic chemical plants, and roaring furnaces where the sky is permanently stained a bruised purple gray, and the ground completely vibrates with the relentless mechanical pounding of heavy steel presses. But to understand the absolute catastrophic, horrific explosion of violence that is about to completely consume this city, you have to look far beyond the city limits and look deep into the terrifying, violently oppressive reality of the American Deep South. For thousands of black families currently living in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, the year 1917 represents an absolute terrifying breaking point. The southern agricultural economy has been completely devastated by the invasive boll weevil, completely destroying the cotton crops, while catastrophic floods have washed away whatever meager existence sharecroppers had managed to scrape out of the muddy earth. But worse than the economic devastation is the absolute inescapable psychological and physical terror of the Jim Crow system, where a black man can be brutally lynched, burned alive, or completely erased from existence simply for looking at a white person the wrong way or asking for a fair price for his labor. So when the incredibly wealthy corporate barons of the northern industrial cities begin sending labor agents deep into the South, offering free train tickets and promising massive, unprecedented wages of $2 or $3 a day, the response is an absolute massive human exodus known as the Great Migration. Thousands of incredibly brave black pioneers, desperate to save their children from the violent Southern terror, pack their entire meager lives into cardboard suitcases and crowd onto the stifling hot segregated cars of the Illinois Central Railroad, traveling hundreds of miles north toward what they desperately believe is the promised land of freedom and economic opportunity. But the incredibly grim, brutal reality of East St. Louis is absolutely not a sanctuary of northern freedom. It is a deeply corrupt, heavily segregated industrial trap, completely controlled by incredibly wealthy corporate barons who view all human life, regardless of race, as entirely disposable, replaceable cogs in their massive wartime profit machines. When the black migrants step off the heavy iron trains onto the soot-stained platforms of East St. Louis, they are instantly corralled into the absolute worst, most deeply impoverished, and dangerously unsanitary sections of the city, forced to live in completely dilapidated wooden shacks with absolutely no indoor plumbing, no clean water, and no paved roads, completely surrounded by the toxic runoff of the massive chemical plants. And the wealthy industrialists who own the massive aluminum ore company, the sprawling American steel foundries, and the massive armor meatpacking plants are executing a highly calculated, incredibly cynical, and totally ruthless economic strategy. The white working-class laborers of East St. Louis, completely exhausted by the hellish, dangerous working conditions and the incredibly stagnant poverty wages, have actively begun to unionize, organizing massive strikes and demanding that the corporate elite actually share a fraction of the massive wartime profits they are generating. The corporate bosses, sitting safely in their pristine, beautifully air-conditioned, insulated offices directly across the river in the wealthy enclaves of St. Louis, Missouri, entirely refuse to negotiate with the striking white labor unions. Instead, they intentionally actively recruit the thousands of desperate black Southern migrants specifically to cross the picket lines and work as strikebreakers, effectively completely weaponizing desperate black labor to utterly crush the white working-class resistance. It is a completely flawless, sick, incredibly effective mechanism of capitalist exploitation, deliberately pitting the two most vulnerable, desperate, and impoverished populations completely against one another, fighting for crumbs, while the wealthy corporate owners watch from across the river, completely untouched by the extreme volatility and absolute racial hatred they are actively, intentionally creating. The white working-class laborers, rather than directing their completely justified economic anger and frustration at the incredibly wealthy corporate bosses who are actively ruthlessly exploiting them, allow their deep economic anxiety to rapidly, completely mutate into a terrifying, homicidal racial hatred directed entirely at the innocent black migrants who are simply trying to feed their starving families. The white labor union leaders hold massive, furious rallies in the city center, standing on wooden soapboxes and using incredibly violent, explicit racist rhetoric, completely dehumanizing the black workers and telling the massive, angry crowds of white men that the black migrants are actively stealing their jobs, completely ruining their city, and explicitly plotting to violently take over the local government. The political establishment of East St. Louis, completely dominated by a notoriously corrupt, deeply entrenched political machine led by a notoriously useless mayor named Fred Mollman, realizes that the rapidly growing black population actually possesses enough newly acquired voting power to completely unseat the corrupt Democratic machine in the upcoming municipal elections. So the politicians, instead of attempting to calm the explosive racial tension, deliberately completely align themselves with the furious white mobs, using the threat of overwhelming racial violence as a blunt, horrific instrument of absolute voter suppression. The local police force, deeply intertwined with the corrupt political machine and completely sympathetic to the white laborers, completely abandons any pretense of maintaining the peace, actively looking the other way as roaming groups of angry white men begin to violently harass black citizens on the street corners. By late May of 1917, the sweltering, humid air of the city is incredibly dense, completely vibrating with an absolute terrifying promise of mass violence as white mobs begin randomly, violently attacking black workers who are simply walking home from their exhausting, brutal 12-hour shifts at the aluminum foundries, pulling them off the electric streetcars, beating them with heavy iron pipes, and completely terrorizing the segregated neighborhoods, while the local authorities stand completely idly by. The black citizens of East St. Louis, rapidly realizing that the northern police force is exactly as complicit, completely useless, and incredibly dangerous as the southern sheriffs they had just desperately fled, begin heavily arming themselves, legally, buying revolvers and shotguns, completely determined to absolutely fiercely defend their homes, their hard-earned wages, and their families from the surging, terrifying tide of state-sanctioned white supremacist terror. The entire city is a massive, incredibly volatile industrial powder keg, completely overflowing with unmitigated racial hatred, extreme economic desperation, and total, absolute political corruption, just desperately, violently waiting for a single chaotic, bloody spark in the dark to completely detonate and entirely transform the banks of the mighty Mississippi River into a horrific, apocalyptic slaughterhouse. The suffocating, unbearable tension that had been slowly wrapping its incredibly heavy hands around the throat of East St. Louis for months finally violently snapped on the incredibly hot, sweltering night of July 1st, 1917. As the exhausted black citizens were desperately trying to sleep in their cramped, completely dilapidated wooden homes in the deeply segregated southern districts of the city, a completely unmarked black Ford automobile suddenly tore down the unpaved dirt streets at breakneck speed. The white men sitting inside the speeding vehicle, completely hidden by the darkness of the night, casually extended heavy revolvers and repeating rifles out of the windows and began firing completely indiscriminately directly into the fragile wooden walls of the black homes, completely terrorizing the sleeping families and shattering the fragile peace of the night. This was a completely calculated, incredibly cowardly act of state-sanctioned psychological warfare designed entirely to provoke a violent response. The terrified black residents who had spent the last 2 months buying firearms and desperately preparing to defend their families from the inevitable white supremacist invasion immediately grabbed their shotguns and their hunting rifles, rushing out onto their dark front porches, completely determined to protect their wives and their children from the roaming death squads. They hastily dragged massive heavy church bells and wooden furniture into the muddy streets, rapidly constructing makeshift barricades to prevent any more vehicles from speeding through their neighborhood, completely ready to make a desperately brave stand. And then the absolute catastrophic, horrific tragedy unfolded. Just an hour after the initial drive-by shooting, a second completely identical unmarked black Ford automobile turned the corner and slowly drove directly toward the armed black defenders waiting behind the barricades. In the pitch-black darkness of the industrial night, entirely unable to see the faces of the men inside the vehicle, the black citizens naturally, completely logically assumed that the exact same white vigilantes had returned to finish the slaughter. The defenders, absolutely refusing to let their neighborhood be shot up again, immediately unleashed a massive, deafening hail of completely justified defensive gunfire directly into the approaching vehicle, entirely shattering the glass and completely riddling the metal chassis with heavy-caliber bullets. But the incredibly horrific reality was that the men inside the second vehicle were not the original vigilantes. They were plainclothes police detectives who had been dispatched to investigate the initial shooting, completely driving an unmarked car that looked exactly like the one used by the white mob. The devastating, completely tragic crossfire left 2 white police officers dead in the street, and this unintentional, completely defensive shooting became the absolute ultimate psychological blank check the violent white supremacist establishment had been desperately waiting for. The deeply corrupt local authorities, completely abandoning any pretense of justice or maintaining public order, deliberately decided to weaponize the bodies of their own fallen officers to completely ignite the city. On the morning of July 2nd, the police deliberately parked the completely bullet-riddled, blood-soaked police car directly in front of the massive labor temple downtown, leaving the shattered glass and the blood entirely visible, intentionally using the vehicle as a grotesque, massive visual monument designed entirely to whip the gathering crowds of angry white working-class men into an absolute psychotic, homicidal frenzy. The corrupt local politicians and the fiercely racist union leaders stood on the steps of the building screaming into massive megaphones, entirely falsely claiming that the black population had launched a highly coordinated, completely unprovoked armed rebellion to slaughter the white citizens of the city, completely ignoring the reality that the black defenders were simply firing at what they believed was a violent drive by shooting in the dark. By the time the massive, incredibly loud factory whistles blew, signaling the end of the morning industrial shift, the absolute terrifying point of no return had been violently crossed. A massive, incredibly furious, heavily armed white mob, numbering in the thousands and completely fueled by a terrifying cocktail of deep economic anxiety, intense racial hatred, and a sudden absolute realization of their own entirely unchecked state-sanctioned power poured directly through the downtown commercial streets. They began dragging completely innocent, terrified black men, women, and teenagers directly off the electric streetcars, violently beating them to death with heavy cobblestones, iron pipes, and completely bare fists, right in the middle of the bustling commercial district in broad daylight, while hundreds of white spectators completely casually watched the horrific slaughter from the sidewalks, actively cheering and clapping, as if they were watching a completely normal theatrical performance. The local police force, the very men sworn to absolutely uphold the law and completely protect the innocent citizens of the city, completely entirely abandoned their duty, actively laughing, casually smoking their cigars, and explicitly pointing the massive white mob directly toward the densest black residential neighborhoods. The violence rapidly entirely escalated from targeted downtown beatings into an absolute highly coordinated campaign of complete industrial ethnic cleansing. As the sweltering sun began to set, casting long, terrifying shadows over the soot-stained city, the heavily armed vigilantes began systematically setting the entire black residential district completely on fire. They marched down the unpaved streets, throwing massive heavy glass bottles filled with highly combustible kerosene directly through the front windows of the dilapidated wooden homes, instantly igniting towering infernos that rapidly completely consumed entire city blocks. When the deeply terrified black families, realizing their homes were completely burning to the ground, desperately attempted to run out their front doors, they were immediately met by a devastating, completely unavoidable hail of high-powered rifle fire from white snipers who had meticulously, completely, strategically positioned themselves on the surrounding brick rooftops, explicitly waiting for the families to flee the flames. The white mob deliberately, absolutely forced innocent men, women, and tiny children to make the completely unimaginable, agonizing, impossible choice to either stay inside and burn completely alive in their own beds, or run out into the dirt streets and be immediately violently cut in half by heavy rifle fire. When the local East St. Louis Fire Department finally arrived with their massive horse-drawn pump wagons, desperately trying to extinguish the towering walls of flame, the furious white mob actively, violently attacked the firefighters using heavy steel axes to completely sever the heavy canvas fire hoses, actively rendering the fire engines completely, entirely useless. The heavily armed vigilantes actively pointed their rifles directly at the firefighters' heads, explicitly, violently ordering them to step completely back and let the entire black neighborhood completely burn to absolute ash, completely ensuring that the absolute destruction of the black community was entirely absolute and total. The sheer apocalyptic scale of the destruction currently consuming the black neighborhoods of East St. Louis was entirely unprecedented in the deeply blood-soaked history of American industrial labor violence. The dark, heavily polluted sky above the massive aluminum foundries and the sprawling brick meatpacking plants was completely blotted out by incredibly thick, suffocating columns of jet-black smoke billowing violently upward from the hundreds of incinerated wooden homes. The intense radiating heat from the towering infernos was so absolutely overwhelming, so incredibly devastating, that it actively melted the heavy glass windows of the surrounding commercial buildings and forced the heavily armed white vigilante mobs to physically step back from the massive, roaring flames they had just intentionally ignited. But stepping back absolutely did not mean the heavily armed death squads were finished with their horrific state-sanctioned campaign of total ethnic cleansing. They simply repositioned themselves, forming massive, terrifying, heavily armed gauntlets along the muddy dirt roads and the cobblestone intersections, meticulously waiting in the dark shadows for the completely terrified, innocent black families to be violently driven out of the massive infernos by the suffocating smoke and the sheer absolute terror of burning alive in their own beds. As the deeply exhausted, completely traumatized black men, women, and tiny crying infants frantically burst through the flaming, shattered wooden doors of their burning homes, desperately gasping for air, they were instantly, violently met by the absolute deafening, devastating mechanical roar of high-powered hunting rifles and heavy double-barreled shotguns fired at absolute point-blank range. The white mob, entirely unhinged by a massive, deeply sick, psychotic bloodlust, did not just want to drive the black laborers out of the city, they absolutely wanted to completely erase their physical existence from the absolute face of the earth. And the absolute most terrifying, deeply, profoundly horrifying aspect of this entire industrial bloodbath was actively unfolding right in front of the eyes of the absolute highest authorities of the state government. The governor of Illinois, having been entirely informed of the massive apocalyptic riots destroying the city, had officially actively deployed heavily armed units of the State National Guard to the soot-stained streets of East St. Louis, ostensibly with the explicit orders to completely quell the violence, disarm the massive roaming mobs, and actively restore law and order to the shattered municipality. When the deeply terrified, completely desperate black citizens who were actively, frantically running for their lives, dodging heavy-caliber bullets and completely surrounded by the towering, roaring flames, saw the heavy olive-drab military transport trucks rolling slowly into the burning neighborhoods, they absolutely believed that they were finally miraculously being rescued from the completely unchecked terror of the vigilantes. They frantically ran directly toward the fully uniformed state soldiers with their hands raised high in the air, desperately begging for basic human protection, pleading with the military men to completely stop the massive white mobs from slaughtering their children in the muddy streets. But the absolute horrific, entirely sickening reality was that the massive military deployment was an absolute terrifying mirage. The heavily armed state soldiers, completely abandoning their oaths, their discipline, and any basic concept of human morality, did absolutely nothing to stop the mass murder actively unfolding directly in front of their faces. Instead, the uniformed military men actively fraternized with the heavily armed white death squads, casually leaning against their heavy military transport trucks, smoking cigarettes, and actively laughing out loud as completely innocent, terrified American citizens were violently, brutally beaten to absolute death with heavy iron pipes directly on the cobblestones right at their military boots. The betrayal by the state was absolute, complete, and entirely devastating. In some of the absolute most horrific, deeply documented instances of the entire apocalyptic massacre, the State National Guard soldiers actually completely handed their heavy military-issue bolt-action rifles and their heavy military ammunition directly to the furious white vigilantes, explicitly, actively providing the racist death squads with the absolute highest-grade lethal military weaponry available to entirely ensure the absolute maximum possible body count. Other deeply corrupt state soldiers actively participated in the massive, horrific slaughter themselves, joining the violent white mobs in hunting down defenseless black men in the dark, smoke-filled alleyways, and violently aggressively using their heavy wooden military rifle butts to completely beat the terrified citizens into absolute, total unconsciousness. The profound psychological trauma of realizing with absolute chilling certainty that the local police force, the completely corrupt city government, and the heavy military forces of the actual state government are all actively, intentionally working together in absolute unison to completely facilitate your total extermination is a level of deep, profound horror that entirely defies all human comprehension. The black population of East St. Louis, realizing that they had been completely abandoned by the country they were actively helping to build through their massive, excruciatingly painful industrial labor, had absolutely no choice but to attempt a completely desperate, terrifying mass exodus out of the heavily burning hostile city. The only absolute viable physical escape route available to the thousands of deeply terrified, freezing, bleeding, and completely exhausted black refugees was the massive, heavy iron span of the Eads Bridge, a gigantic, awe-inspiring architectural marvel of heavy steel and heavy stone that stretched massively across the incredibly dark, deep, dangerous, rushing waters of the Mississippi River, directly connecting the burning, apocalyptic hellscape of East St. Louis, Illinois, to the relative safety of St. Louis, Missouri. The desperate, deeply panicked migration toward the massive Eads Bridge rapidly completely became one of the absolute most horrific, terrifying, heavily blood-soaked death marches in the entire violent history of the United States. Thousands of entirely defenseless black men, women, carrying tiny, screaming infants tightly wrapped in their soot-stained arms, and deeply terrified small children frantically sprinted through the heavily dark, incredibly smoky, completely violent streets of the downtown commercial district, desperately trying to reach the heavy stone arches of the massive bridge before the roaming white death squads could completely intercept them. But the deeply racist, heavily armed vigilante mobs, actively anticipating this exact, desperate mass exodus, had completely, intentionally, heavily fortified the entire massive approach to the Eads Bridge, entirely transforming the cobblestone entrance into a horrific, absolute, inescapable, heavily armed slaughterhouse. The white men, entirely emboldened by the absolute total complicity of the military and the police, heavily lined the completely dark streets leading directly to the massive river crossing, holding incredibly heavy iron crowbars, thick wooden baseball bats, heavily loaded shotguns, and completely thick, heavy hemp ropes, entirely prepared to inflict maximum devastating casualties on the desperate fleeing population. As the massive waves of terrified black refugees frantically approached the heavy entrance of the massive bridge, desperately looking for the absolute safety of the Missouri border, the massive white mob unleashed an absolute terrifying tidal wave of complete homicidal destruction. Innocent, completely terrified black men were violently, aggressively ripped directly away from their screaming, completely hysterical wives, violently thrown to the hard cobblestone ground, and absolutely beaten to a bloody, unrecognizable pulp by dozens of angry white men wielding heavy iron pipes, completely stolen directly from the massive aluminum foundries. The absolute, sheer, incredibly horrific extreme level of unchecked, barbaric, absolute violence actively occurring at the massive entrance to the Eads Bridge was completely, entirely unprecedented. Heavily armed white vigilantes actively strung up massive, heavy hemp nooses directly over the heavy wooden crossbeams of the municipal street lamps and the incredibly tall, heavy iron telegraph poles that lined the commercial streets, actively, brutally lynching multiple innocent black men right in the middle of the massive, chaotic, deeply violent street, entirely illuminated by the incredibly bright orange glow of the heavily burning city directly behind them. The incredibly horrific, absolute, sheer, terrifying visual of entire burning neighborhoods casting incredibly long, dark, terrifying shadows across the brutally beaten, swinging bodies of innocent American citizens completely, permanently, deeply scarred the absolute souls of the thousands of deeply terrified refugees who were literally forced to physically step directly over the bloody, mutilated corpses of their own beloved friends and family members just to reach the heavy, massive steel pedestrian walkways of the massive bridge. For those incredibly, deeply fortunate, lucky, completely terrified individuals who actually miraculously managed to absolutely survive the completely devastating, terrifying, heavily armed, brutal gauntlet at the absolute massive entrance of the massive bridge, their absolute profound, deeply terrifying, incredibly horrific, absolutely devastating nightmare was completely, entirely far from actually being over. The massive white mob, entirely consumed by an incredibly deep, psychotic, absolutely terrifying, homicidal, complete frenzy, actively, aggressively, violently pursued the deeply terrified, completely exhausted black refugees directly onto the massive, heavy steel spans of the massive bridge itself. The deeply terrified, completely defenseless families frantically, incredibly, completely ran for their incredibly fragile, absolute lives directly across the incredibly long, massive, heavy steel structure entirely suspended massively high directly above the fast-rushing, dark, heavily polluted absolute waters of the massive Mississippi River. The incredibly angry, furious white vigilantes actively, violently caught up to dozens of the completely slow, heavily exhausted, completely injured, incredibly terrified black citizens directly on the incredibly massive open steel structure of the massive bridge. In an act of absolute, entirely, incredibly, deeply, profoundly horrifying, sick, complete cruelty, the heavily armed white men violently, physically lifted the incredibly, deeply terrified, bleeding, defenseless black men, completely, incredibly women, and incredibly terrified, entirely innocent children, entirely, physically, directly over the incredibly heavy metal, massive railings of the massive structure, and actively, completely, violently threw them, entirely alive, into the completely dark, massive, incredibly heavily rushing, deeply terrifying waters of the incredibly massive river, completely, entirely, directly, far down, absolutely, completely below. The absolutely terrified, incredibly innocent citizens completely violently fell through the completely dark, heavily smoke-filled, incredibly polluted, absolute terrifying, completely toxic night air, completely screaming entirely in absolute profound, deep, absolute, complete terror, before completely violently impacting the incredibly deeply freezing, completely dark, rushing absolute waters completely below, absolutely drowning entirely in the absolute massive, completely dark, absolute profound depths of the massive Mississippi completely river, actively, heavily weighed, completely entirely down by their entirely soaked, heavy, completely entire work clothing, and the incredibly entirely absolute deep, complete, total, incredibly heavy exhaustion of the completely absolute entirely incredibly terrifying ordeal, completely entirely ensuring that their absolute incredibly deeply complete, incredibly total absolute terrifying murders completely entirely would leave absolute incredibly entirely deeply absolutely no absolute complete physical trace for the absolutely completely incredibly corrupt state absolute authorities, completely, absolutely, entirely, to completely, absolute, actively investigate. The ashes of East St. Louis were absolutely still smoldering when the deeply corrupt white political establishment, heavily financed by the very corporate industrialists who had intentionally engineered the entire conflict, immediately went to work completely rewriting the narrative of the massacre to entirely blame the black victims for their own slaughter. They initiated a series of completely farcical, heavily rigged grand jury investigations that actively protected the white vigilantes and the corrupt police officers, while explicitly aggressively targeting the black survivors who had dared to defend their homes. The local white newspapers, completely complicit in the state-sanctioned terror, actively published incredibly sensationalized, completely fabricated articles claiming the entire massacre was a highly coordinated black uprising, entirely and completely ignoring the massive white mobs, the severed fire hoses, and the mass graves. They painted the white rioters as victims defending their city, a sickening inversion of reality designed to protect the guilty and further traumatize the survivors. But the incredible, unimaginable horror of East St. Louis was so absolute, so completely devastating, that it could not be contained by the local corrupt press. News of the slaughter rapidly spread across the entire country, sending an absolute catastrophic shockwave through the national black community. The brilliant, fearless investigative journalist Ida B. Wells immediately traveled directly into the heart of the smoldering, completely devastated city, actively interviewing the traumatized survivors and meticulously documenting the absolute horrific reality of the state-sanctioned ethnic cleansing, completely refusing to let the white establishment control the historical narrative. In New York City, the NAACP, completely horrified by the total, absolute failure of the federal government to protect American citizens, organized one of the most profound, incredibly powerful, and visually stunning protests in the entire history of the United States, known as the Silent Parade. On July 28, 1917, nearly 10,000 completely silent black men, women, and children, dressed entirely in immaculate white clothing, marched down Fifth Avenue in absolute, terrifying silence. They held massive banners that explicitly, directly indicted the federal government for its complete cowardice and its absolute complicity in the mass murder. The only sound on the bustling streets of New York that day was the heavy, rhythmic beating of muffled drums, a profoundly haunting, incredibly powerful acoustic monument to the innocent lives completely obliterated in the industrial meat grinder of East St. Louis. It was a massive visual declaration that the black population of America would absolutely not be intimidated. They would not be silenced, and they would never completely surrender their constitutional rights to the violent whims of the white supremacist mob. But despite this incredibly brave national outcry, the deeply entrenched white power structure completely successfully utilized the exact same tactic of total historical erasure that they had perfected in Wilmington, Thibodaux, and Elaine, completely, deliberately scrubbing the East St. Louis massacre from the official state history textbooks. For an entire century, the massive industrial slaughter of innocent American workers was completely, entirely hidden from the children who grew up walking the exact same soot-stained streets. This deliberate, absolute historical amnesia is not a bug in the system. It is the exact core feature of the massive psychological control grid that is now completely mutated into the digital algorithm that currently dictates your entire perception of reality. The people who built the system absolutely pray that you will just keep scrolling, that you will stay completely distracted by meaningless, superficial digital garbage, and that you will never take the time to completely, deeply understand the massive, horrific blood price that was paid for the rights you currently take for granted. If you do not know about the silent marchers on Fifth Avenue, if you do not know about the people thrown off the Eads Bridge, you lack the absolute essential historical context to understand the exact same patterns of systemic oppression and state complicity that are happening right in front of your face today. You must make a completely conscious, deliberate choice right now to stop being a passive consumer of algorithmic noise and become a highly dangerous, active archivist of the absolute truth. You must take the story of East St. Louis and use it as a massive intellectual weapon to completely shatter the digital hypnosis. Every time you speak these names, every time you share this brutal, suppressed history, you are actively engaging in the exact same incredibly brave resistance that the Silent Parade represented. We are completely committed to building a massive, unbreakable global battalion of people who absolutely refuse to let the true history of the people be permanently deleted by the architects of this system. Stand up right now, prove that you are completely paying attention, and show the establishment that we are absolutely everywhere by dropping your city and your country in the comments below right now to permanently map out our global battalion and make sure they know we are never going back to sleep. The absolute terrifying silence that finally fell over the completely ruined, soot-stained streets of East St. Louis the morning after the massive slaughter was not the silence of peace. It was the suffocating, heavy silence of a completely traumatized population, realizing that their entire existence had been completely reduced to smoking ash. As the harsh morning sun finally broke through the incredibly thick, heavy black columns of toxic industrial smoke, the sheer apocalyptic scale of the state-sanctioned ethnic cleansing became absolutely, entirely undeniable. Entire massive city blocks that had just 24 hours ago been bustling, vibrant neighborhoods filled with incredibly hard-working black families were now completely flattened, reduced to nothing more than a horrific moonscape of heavily charred wooden beams, twisted iron bed frames, and the deeply sickening smell of incinerated human remains. The completely traumatized, deeply exhausted black survivors who had miraculously managed to hide in the freezing, muddy drainage ditches, or who had somehow survived the absolute horrific, terrifying gauntlet on the Eads Bridge, began to slowly, cautiously return to the heavily burning ruins of their homes, completely, desperately searching the smoldering ashes for any absolute sign of their missing children, their husbands, and their wives. But they were not met with absolutely any compassion or any basic human decency from the deeply corrupt white establishment. Instead, the local authorities, the exact same completely compromised police officers who had actively laughed while innocent citizens were beaten to death on the cobblestones, actively began conducting massive, highly militarized, heavily armed sweeps through the exact same ruined neighborhoods, deliberately, actively targeting the completely traumatized black survivors for mass arrest. The deeply corrupt political machine of East St. Louis, completely terrified of the absolute massive national backlash that was rapidly brewing, realized they urgently, desperately needed a scapegoat to completely justify the horrific mass murder they had just intentionally facilitated. They absolutely refused to arrest the thousands of heavily armed white vigilantes who had actively burned the city to the ground, completely entirely ignoring the massive white mobs that had actively marched through the downtown streets in broad daylight. Instead, the entirely rigged, deeply racist local judicial system aggressively, violently turned its absolute full legal weight entirely against the incredibly brave black men who had dared to legally defend their own homes from the heavily armed white death squads. The absolute most prominent, incredibly devastating example of this entirely farcical legal lynching was the active, highly coordinated state prosecution of Dr. Leroy Bundy. Dr. Bundy was an incredibly successful, highly respected, wealthy black dentist, a prominent civic leader, and an incredibly brave man who had actively helped organize the completely legal armed defense of the black community when the local police force completely abandoned them. The corrupt white political establishment, entirely, absolutely terrified by the sheer existence of a wealthy, educated, fearless black leader, actively, completely fabricated a massive, entirely fictitious narrative, claiming that Dr. Bundy was the absolute mastermind of a massive, violent, armed black rebellion, actively charging him with inciting the entire massacre. They dragged this incredibly, completely innocent man through an absolute, highly publicized, entirely rigged show trial, completely packing the jury box with fiercely racist white men and actively allowing the local, highly sensationalized white newspapers to completely crucify him in the press before he even stepped foot into the courtroom. The state government aggressively, relentlessly pushed for his complete legal execution, desperately wanting to use his heavily publicized legal lynching as the ultimate horrific psychological warning to any black citizen in the entire United States who ever believed they had the absolute constitutional right to self-defense. While Dr. Bundy and dozens of other entirely innocent black defenders were being aggressively, violently railroaded directly into the heavy iron cages of the state penitentiary, the deeply corrupt white industrialists who had actively, intentionally engineered the massive racial conflict to crush the white labor unions were entirely insulated from any legal or moral consequences. The wealthy corporate barons, sitting safely in their beautifully appointed air-conditioned boardrooms directly across the river, quietly, actively watched as their massive, heavily polluting aluminum foundries and sprawling meatpacking plants slowly ground back to life, entirely, completely untouched by the apocalyptic bloodbath they had actively, intentionally financed. The federal government in Washington, D.C., absolutely, completely paralyzed by profound institutional cowardice and completely, heavily, deeply reliant on the massive industrial output of the East St. Louis factories for the ongoing war effort, completely, actively, entirely refused to intervene. Congress completely reluctantly held a series of highly publicized, completely useless investigative hearings where traumatized black survivors and deeply horrified independent investigators explicitly detailed the absolutely unimaginable, horrific, completely barbaric atrocities that had occurred. The severed fire hoses, the children thrown entirely alive into the massive burning infernos, the completely innocent men violently lynched from the heavy iron telegraph poles. The completely horrific, devastating truth of the state-sanctioned mass murder was completely, entirely, explicitly spoken directly into the absolute highest official congressional records of the United States government, and yet absolutely, completely, entirely nothing was done. Not a single federal charge was ever brought against the corrupt local mayor. Not a single federal indictment was ever completely filed against the deeply complicit state National Guard soldiers who had actively, entirely handed their heavy military rifles to the furious white mob. The complete, absolute, total failure of the federal government to actively protect the innocent American citizens of East St. Louis completely, explicitly, entirely confirmed to the black population that the 14th Amendment was absolutely, completely nothing more than a completely, entirely empty promise written on a completely, entirely worthless piece of paper. This profound, deep psychological trauma completely, entirely shattered the absolute illusion of the Great Migration, completely, entirely proving that the exact same deeply terrifying, violently oppressive white supremacist system that actively operated the massive cotton plantations of the Deep South was completely, entirely alive and actively, violently functioning in the massive industrial cities of the North. Among the deeply traumatized, terrified, completely freezing refugees who had miraculously, actively, completely survived the horrific burning of the city was a young, completely, entirely terrified 11-year-old black girl who had hidden in absolute, complete terror as the heavily armed white death squads actively burned her entire world to ash. That heavily traumatized young girl would eventually grow up to become the incredibly famous, massively successful international superstar, Josephine Baker, who completely, entirely, permanently fled the United States for France, completely, entirely, absolutely refusing to live in a country that had actively, explicitly allowed its own completely innocent citizens to be entirely, violently slaughtered in the muddy, soot-stained streets of East St. Louis.